Chapter 15. Into the Fray. So then the idiots go off and get themselves shot up with javelins and darts. Caius had his leg up on a fallen stump to rebandage it. The rest of the squad took their ease around the campfire. Their breath steamed slightly as they talked. So much for the great Chario of Volda. We've lost some good cavalry and the Batavians will be needing a new king. Caius looked up from his leg to regard his fellow riders. Aulus snorted. They'll have a job finding one. Many of his nobles were just as impetuous in running down the Cherusci. You have a point there. Just lucky we weren't put into the expeditionary force. Caius began to unwind his bandage. General Stetinus didn't do so badly. Came in the nick of time, as I heard it, someone said. If the Batavians hadn't chased the tribesmen into their trap, they wouldn't have needed rescuing in the first place, one of the other men observed. Caius nodded, conceding the point. I can't imagine Caesar is well pleased with his general for letting them butcher our ally. No doubt, Aulus mused. Of course, if General Silius hadn't kept us back here, we could have done something about it, perhaps. Silius knows what he's doing, Marcus said. He looked at Caius's leg. You going to be able to fight with that? Fit for duty, sir, Caius reported. The wound had healed nicely, and I could smell no foul humour in it. The retightening of the bandage was as much about showing off his wound to his fellows as a matter of genuine need. It looks well enough to me, Marcus agreed. Just don't get one to match it tomorrow. It's certain the battle will be joined tomorrow then, sir, Aulus asked. You were part of the scouting party that followed the deserters' directions, Caius said. Just the fires alone should tell you that Arminius is waiting to meet us. Caius rewound his stained bandage. Not to mention all that awful singing, he winked. It's not as simple as you make it out, Aulus protested. Of course I know they are close, but how many times have they just melted back into these cursed woods the moment we try to engage them? We think they'll stand this time, Aulus, Marcus said. Arminius was near as mad as Flavius when they met by all accounts. The Germans are sick of running, so I'd say it's a fair bet that... The sound of footsteps approaching our fire made me look up. Marcus's reaction was barely an instant behind mine. Who goes there? A friend, came the reply. Men of the 14th, another voice added from the gloom. Caius stood, his bandage dangling as he offered a hand. Well met, brothers. Are you ready to make Caesar proud in the morning? The first soldier hesitated for an instant at the sight of the grimy bandage. He looked back and the man behind gave a slight nod. The legionary gripped the cavalryman's wrist. Caius's eye flicked to the man behind. And you, friend? I'm sure our commander is proud enough already, the second man said. He had his cloak bundled tightly about him and his hood cast flickering shadows over his face. You seem confident of his feelings, friend. Marcus strained to penetrate the gloom under the hood, then gave up and stretched out a hand. Perhaps you are more intimately acquainted with our commander than I. The hooded man shrugged. I've wandered much of this camp tonight and found nothing that would shame him. The stranger took Marcus's wrist. Well met at any rate, my master said. Having gauged that the newcomer was no threat, I rose and padded over. The scent of the man was familiar. I caught the hint of brass or gold beneath his cloak. Whatever the metal was, it had been polished to an impossible sheen. Marcus looked to the first man, whose hood was thrown back. I know you, don't I? You're on Caesar's staff, are you not? The man blanched, perhaps slightly taken aback at being recognized. I do have the honor of serving with Caesar, yes. His brow knitted. Marcus Atratinus, Marcus supplied. One of Silius's officers. Marcus gave the man an appraising look. What brings you out tonight? Do you find you have no taste for the officers' tents? No more than you have, it seems, the officer countered. True enough. My apologies, friend. I don't seem to recall... Marcus was interrupted by a sudden cry from beyond the camp walls. Men of Rome! The Latin was heavy and accented. Men of Rome, do not follow your chief to his destruction. You have seen the bones of those who fought with Varus. Would you join them? A sound like an indrawn breath seemed to sweep through the camp. If the German had hoped to evoke fear, he had sparked something entirely different. Legionaries stiffened and began to murmur amongst themselves. Many spoke of how the tribesmen had desecrated the mound we had raised to the dead in the Teutoburg. I felt anger and not an ounce of fear from those about me. Our small group joined many other men as they headed to the ramparts to look down upon the German agent. I was unable to see beyond the palisade, so I could only guess at what man might be calling out to us in the night. Other camp dogs let out howls and bayed at the intruder. As ever, I waited to see what Marcus wanted me to do. Men of Rome, the speaker outside continued. Arminius is not a cruel man. If you will but renounce this petty prince you serve and give him your loyalty, he promises each man 100 sesterces a day for as long as this war lasts." Some jeers followed this promise, but no soldier could laugh too hard at such a sum. The speaker, emboldened by the muted response, continued to make promises. "And when the war is over and your Caesar is food for ravens—" I saw the cloaked man next to Marcus stiffen at this promise. His knuckles whitened on a sword even finer than the one that Marcus wore. "When the vanquished have withdrawn, Arminius will offer German wives and German lands to all who have shown him loyalty." Aulus let out a huge laugh. "What is it that you offer then?" he called. "Do you take us for fools? The only gold I need is daylight, because this battle cannot come soon enough. When your long-haired chief is dead and cravens like you have run, we will take your land and your women, along with a few coins that such as you might possess." Aulus leaned over the walls. "Looks like a nice horse he's riding, boys. What will you give me for it?" Laughter erupted from the walls and echoed through the camp. It was so loud that I didn't hear the rider leave, just the jeering that went on until he was long gone. "Go on right away," someone called after the retreating herald. "You call that riding?" another called back, picking up on the insult. "Have pity! Arminius left him raw tonight," one of the legionaries cried in a comically strained voice. That got a gale of harsh laughter from the soldiers. "Someone stop him! That's my horse!" a cry from another section of the line. "Who wants that horse? Look to have 2 asses to me," came the rebuttal. Marcus left the wall with his men and trudged back to the fire. The 2 men in cloaks did not return with us, but I did see that fine sword again the next morning. "You all know your orders," Germanicus' voice boomed out over the assembled men. "Stay in formation. Do not give way to the savagery of those we face. Today we will meet the man who betrayed Varus and slaughtered so many of our brothers. Today we will have revenge." A cry went up and the men hammered their shields. Germanicus turned dramatically, taking all men into his gaze. His fine sword, the one I had seen the night before, seemed to leap from its sheath, and he held it high over our heads. "Do not doubt that we will have victory. For last night I had a dream sent by Mars himself." The sword sliced through the air, emphasizing his point. "In my dream I drove this blade into the throat of a goat." The silvered steel plunged down. The men took a step back. "I struck deep, brothers. So Mars heard the cry. The blood flowed free as it will flow free today. But I had no need to worry about blood, for no sooner had the blood touched my robes than my grandmother Julia appeared, and she held even finer vestments, testimony to the glory we will win this day." He turned again, pacing in front of his audience. "So I say to you, do not fear blood, embrace blood, for we shall cut our cloth for the ages, and soldiers' crimson will be replaced by gold." The sword flashed as he raised it in the new morning sun. We marched. The Germans awaited us on the hills above the plain of Aegistoviso. The waters of the Weser wound through it, creating an obstacle to the west, and tangled trees grew thick on the eastern side of the battlefield. Birds fled, and the sounds of the forest stilled as the Germans advanced, taking the high ground. Our column poured onto the field led by the auxiliaries. The men had been on the march for more than 2 hours, but they seemed fresh and eager, ready. The Germans were no less keen, with the younger warriors crying out for blood. As our ranks began to assume their formation, the patience of the young tribesmen broke, taking with it whatever plan their elders had had for the engagement. First a few, then a growing wave of Germans, more even than Varus had faced, poured down on the Roman lines. Trumpets blared out and the men braced for the impact. The auxiliaries took the brunt of the charge. Marcus and his squad had been placed on the wings, part of the elite units that would execute General Stetinus' cavalry assault. As 6,000 cavalrymen began their charge, 8 birds broke from the trees and swept overhead. Chroniclers would claim that they were eagles, one for each of the legions that fought at Aegistoviso, but I have seen ducks before and never known eagles to fly in such a formation. Whatever they were, the birds were certainly an omen, and the whole army rejoiced to see them. With his troops having made his first move for him, Arminius and his fellow riders were forced to chase the infantry down the hill, thus losing the advantage of higher ground. The cavalry thundered down the eastern side of the battlefield, forcing the tribesmen's reserve troops from their hiding place in the trees. With the reserves dispersed in short order, General Stetinus gave the gesture, and we followed Colonel Pedo as he wheeled to the right and rode hard into the flanks of the massed German infantry. Some of our own riders fell to the arrows still being fired by the Syrian archers in the second rank. The German riders, not already engaged with the infantry, tried to turn to meet us, but they were unable to blunt our assault. As ever, I weaved between the pounding hooves, looking for the exposed flesh of calves. But before I could find my target, two dark shapes came hurtling through the mass, slavering and screaming their hatred. The German dogs were hunters taken to war, all eagerness and fire. They knew enough to avoid the horses, but I wasn't so much bigger than them that they felt the need for caution. Another member of their pack burst between the legs of the fighting men, blood on her muzzle, and a great tear in her side. She squealed as the incoming horses trampled her underfoot. I had to keep moving to avoid a similar fate. The press of men and horses forced me from Marcus's side, and the two smaller dogs came on, instinctively choosing me as an appropriate target. I took a chance and veered further into the darkness on my left. The wings surged and hooves fell about me, but I had bought myself space to move. The wave of cavalry flowed past, and I set my feet, waiting to receive a charge of my own. Sure enough, they were on me moments later. I barely felt the impact, but it wasn't weight that I had to worry about. They had two sets of jaws between them. I only had one. I let the first waste his energy on my shoulder. The old scar tissue gave under the pressure of his fangs, but he found little purchase in the hair and skin. I put my full attention into clamping down on the throat of the second hound. It squealed and thrashed, but a slim hunter never stood a chance against a fighter who had survived Appius's arena. I shook the smaller dog like a straw doll, then turned my attention on my other attacker. Without support, he couldn't match my weight. I used a single paw to send him crashing to the ground. With teeth flashing, I plunged in for the kill. Another pitiful shriek, and the thin soul was loosed from the smaller body under me. I raised my head, blood streaming from my jaws, in time to see Stertinus and the rest of the cavalry that hadn't followed Pero slam into the rear of the German line. It was not just the horses that hit the German ranks. The men who had fled from the trees ahead of the charge added to the chaos. The sound of the impact rose above the clang and scrape of weapons and shields. Its dying echoes were replaced by screams. At that moment, the trumpets rang out again. The auxiliaries melted back and the heavy infantry stepped forward. The already wavering line of German warriors began to fold. Panic moved like a plague through the mass. I heard the calls of the German generals, but there was no order left to be had. The slaughter had begun in earnest. I took off after Marcus and joined him where the fighting was thickest. We chased the Germans as they streamed back into the woods, trying to find salvation in the trees. I brought down a lanky man in skins. He threw me off and tried to regain his feet, but a rider ran him through with a lance as he passed. I struggled to keep up with Marcus and the other riders on the plain, but they had to slow when they got nearer to the river. Some tribesmen threw themselves into the water in the hope of escaping pursuit, but we threw javelins after them, and those we missed were mostly lost in the cold flood. Marcus's unit wheeled at his order and charged down the bank towards a knot of men huddled on the riverbank. The riders had to rein in their horses as the riverbank gave way and carried the cowering men down into the churning water below them. On the plain, the third rank of Germanicus's army pushed through the dwindling ranks of the enemy. At last, even the German commanders knew the battle was lost and joined their men in flight. Marcus let out a yell and we joined him in running down the broken wretches streaming from the battlefield. Germans died in their thousands and bodies could be found for up to 10 miles beyond the plain where the battle started. Past the point where we had left it, the river was near choked with the dead. Some of the fleeing tribesmen tried to climb trees, but they had just become sport for our archers, or failing that, we cut down the trees in which they hid. Any mercy that might have found its way into the legion's stony hearts was killed by the discovery of chains and manacles piled in the woods, proof that the Germans had intended to enslave survivors. The battle had begun before noon, and as the sun sank, more than one German prince bent a knee to our commander. The leaders had little choice. Tribes like the Marsi had seen their young men all but completely slaughtered over 2 years of brutal war. They no longer had the stomach to resist. As devastating as the battle was for the Germans, it did not mark the end of Germanicus's campaign. Arminius had used an old battle trick and hidden his face with the blood from a scalp wound sustained early in the engagement. He took what remained of his army and retreated to the earthworks raised by the Angravarii during an earlier war with the Cherusci.